Well, I'm going to proceed again to discuss the main topic of the day or of the global news, which is the war in Ukraine. I say that, though my impression is that the media is starting to some extent to lose interest in the story, at least parts of it are, and there doesn't seem to be quite the sense of intensity about some of the media coverage that I've been seeing over the last few weeks. Anyway, having said that, the story remains dominant. It remains central to the development of international affairs, and the focus of the crisis is, of course, Ukraine. And the focus of the crisis in Ukraine is Mariupol, where yesterday, for the first time, and today, this morning, the British media began to acknowledge that the fight in Mariupol is probably coming to a close. Now, there's been a series of reports in the British media that the naval infantry, the Marines, the Ukrainian Marines, who along with the Azov battalion were defending the city, they've now published a statement saying that they have been that around half of them have been killed or wounded, that the places that they're running out of food and ammunition. They're making extremely bitter comments about the Ukrainian leadership having essentially abandoned them to their fate, and they speak about the situation now reaching the point where it seems that there will be either a mass surrender of those that are left and the Marines going into captivity, or death for some of those that are left. Now, yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry published a report of a desperate breakout by Ukrainian troops in the Ilyich factory. I'll just read it. It says that on April 11th in Mariupol, the remnants of Ukrainian troops surrounded on the territory of the Ilyich factory made an unsuccessful attempt to break out of the city at night. A group of about 100 Ukrainian soldiers on armored vehicles tried to fight their way out of the plant and leave the city in a northern direction. Artillery and airstrikes foiled this breakthrough attempt. 3 Ukrainian tanks, 5 infantry fighting vehicles, 7 vehicles, and up to 50 personnel were destroyed. Another 42 Ukrainian servicemen voluntarily laid down their arms and surrendered. Now, that's the Russian account of this battle. There's, by the way, been other accounts of this particular fight, this particular breakout attempt. I'm not going to go into the details, but what I will say is that I am providing a link to an article in The Guardian which describes the British take of the fighting there and the fact that the Ukrainian Marines blockaded in Mariupol are now essentially saying that it's almost game over as far as they are concerned. There are other pieces of information about Mariupol. The British media has been running with a story heavily promoted by the British government that some sort of chemical weapon was used by the Russians in Mariupol. There's no confirmation of this, and I would say that this particular story has attracted surprisingly low-key attention. I would be extremely surprised if the Russians did in fact use any prohibited weapons in Mariupol. Why would they do so when, by the admission of the Ukrainian Marines, the last remnants of the Ukrainian troops there are on the verge of giving up? There is another very, very weird story which is circulating and which claims that beneath the Azovstal steelworks, there's a honeycomb of tunnels and bunkers, and all sorts of mysterious laboratories are working there, busy producing all kinds of strange things, and that the technicians and scientists supposedly are still there, many of them from Western countries, and that they're being protected by the Azov battalion, and that this is presumably the reason why there have been all those desperate attempts to evacuate these people from the Azovstal steelworks and to sort of conceal what is going on in these deep underground bunkers. I have to say that this story does somewhat remind me of some science fiction and horror films. Some of you may be familiar with the Resident Evil series, and this does somehow sound a little bit like a rerun of Raccoon City. But I have to say that I'm not going to either assume that this story is true or deny it. I think we need vastly more evidence of what there is actually in the Azovstal steelworks before we assume anything. And for the moment, I'm parking these stories to one side. I'm increasingly coming round to the view, by the way, that what is hiding in the Azovstal steelworks are probably Ukrainian troops, mostly from the Azovstal steelworks, and a large number of Western volunteers. I doubt that there's any NATO personnel there, and I'm a little skeptical of these stories of secret laboratories lurking behind the Azovstal steelworks. It doesn't really make a huge amount of sense to me that they would be located there, given the proximity of Mariupol to the Donbass front lines before the war started, and also given the fact that Mariupol was an obvious target for the Russians in the event of a war, and I can't really see the logic of placing secret laboratories so close to the front lines in a city which the Russians would make it one of their primary tasks to capture. Alongside these articles in the British media about the fact that resistance in Mariupol seems to be, in its last days, there's also been some interesting admissions about the state of the war. Now, you have to read these. You have to, again, go past all the usual claims and propaganda that one reads. From what I can see, the British media is preparing the British public for two things. Firstly, the encirclement, rather not just the encirclement, but the defeat of the Ukrainian troops in Donbass, and of course the surrender in Mariupol. But they are making an admission. I read somewhere, in one of the vast number of articles in the British media that I do read, but I read somewhere an admission, it was the first admission that I've seen, that the Ukrainians have not been able to redeploy the bulk of their forces in Kiev to areas closer to the Donbass. The reason for this is, and this is the first time I saw this admitted in the British media, that there are Russian strike forces, considerable Russian strike forces, still within easy reach in terms of distance of Kiev. That means that the bulk of Ukrainian forces that were defending Kiev are still positioned there because of worries that if they are transferred east, the Russians will simply use that opportunity to reactivate their strike forces. Presumably these are mainly in Belarus, but also perhaps in Kharkiv region. And whilst the Ukrainians are redeployed eastward, the Russians will do a quick strike towards Kiev and might even capture the city. So this plan that the Russians announced some weeks ago, which I discussed previously and which Scott Ritter has also discussed, of using a threat to Kiev to pin down large numbers of Ukrainian troops to defend Kiev and in effect isolating the army in Donbass. To a great extent, it still continues. Perhaps the Ukrainians have been able to transfer some troops from Kiev to the front lines. I've seen suggestions that up to 15,000 Ukrainian troops from Kiev are being relocated to the east, mainly to areas, it seems, around Pavlograd and Dnipropetrovsk, not in the actual area of the cauldron itself. But the bulk of the forces, which are now said to number something like 70,000, Ukrainian forces, which are said to number some 70,000, remain in Kiev in case of a Russian strike on the city. Meanwhile, the Russians continue to launch airstrikes and missile strikes all across Ukraine. I'm not going to devote time and energy to discussing where these are, and it seems that they're continuing gradually and incrementally to push south of Izium towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where the Ukrainian forces in Donbass seem to be preparing their last defenses. Well, that's the military situation to the extent that I can assess it. But in the meantime, there's also been this meeting between the Austrian Chancellor Nehammer and President Putin. It didn't take place in the Kremlin. It took place in Novo-Ogaryovo, which is a residence just outside Moscow, which is often where Putin often resides. And I suspect Putin was not prepared, for various reasons, to meet Nehammer in the Kremlin. I think he took a deliberate decision to downgrade the importance of this meeting. And one has had a description of the meeting from the Austrians, which said that it was an unfriendly visit, that the Austrians made all kinds of threats. They said that the sanctions would continue while the war continued, and all such other things. But apparently Putin, at least according to the Austrians, gave as good as he got. He made it absolutely clear that the Russians will continue with this campaign, that they are not going to be swayed by sanctions pressure or diplomatic pressure, that as far as they're concerned, the war will go on until its final political objectives are achieved. Now that's what we are hearing from the Austrians. The Kremlin, for its part, has not provided a readout, and we've not had a great deal of information about it from the Russians, except essentially confirmation that Putin did indeed take the very hard line that that the Austrians are saying that he did. But perhaps the most interesting thing about this discussion is that apparently Putin and Nehammer did meet one-to-one, but Putin refused to speak to Nehammer in German, though he speaks fluent German, and insisted on having a translator, an interpreter with him. Now, I think that's very interesting because it's clear that Nehammer did want to have a one-to-one meeting with Putin, and presumably he didn't want to have anybody present, but Putin's decision to insist on the presence of an interpreter suggests that Putin wanted to have an official stenographic record of the discussion. The function of the interpreter in high-level discussions is not just to translate, to engage in translations of what the two parties are saying to each other. It is also to keep an official written record, a stenographic record of the discussion. And of course, it goes without saying that in Novo-Ogaryovo, whatever meeting room Nehammer met Putin in, the Russians would have been careful to make sure that there were microphones there, and that they would have kept a careful record of all the things that were said, a radio record of all the things that were said. But these kind of transcripts are unofficial, and of course they can be the subject of dispute and controversy, whereas official records taken by interpreters are supposed to be sacrosanct. So that rather suggests to me that Nehammer did come to Moscow with some intention to engage in some kind of secret diplomacy, if you like, or let's not say secret diplomacy, because there's nothing secret about Nehammer's visit, but let's say instead private diplomacy. And Putin, it turns out, was not interested and wanted everything to be on the record, which may have restricted some of the things that Nehammer said. Now, I'm going to actually make a further observation about this. I do wonder whether this trip by this Austrian Chancellor was intended to be public, whether this wasn't, at least from the German and Austrian point of view, intended to be a, shall we say, private or even secret visit. It was not supposed to be publicized, and that the reason that it was eventually publicized was because the Russians refused to play along and made it known that they were not prepared to receive a secret EU emissary in that kind of way. I should say that secret meetings between world leaders, or at least between their officials, are far from uncommon. Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon's national security advisor, for example, visited Beijing before Richard Nixon actually went there, and at a time when China and the United States were formally not even in contact with each other. Nixon sent Kissinger to Beijing, and Kissinger, whilst in Beijing over the course of this secret visit, prepared much of the groundwork for Nixon's later groundbreaking trip to China. So this is not by any means unusual. The Israelis, by the way, did this on a much bigger scale. During the period when the Arab states were claiming to boycott Israel, refusing to have any official contacts with Israel, in fact, Israeli officials, including Israeli prime ministers, would often visit various Arab capitals and have secret discussions with Arab leaders there. Well, I wonder whether this was the intention in this particular case. If so, as I said, the Russians refused to play ball. Now, there's been some speculation about what's happened to Putin. There's been much commentary about the fact that he hasn't been visible in public recently. There's been speculation in the British media that he's hiding somewhere in a bunker. There's also talk in the British media about FSB officials being arrested and all kinds of things of that kind. Things, by the way, which the Russians have emphatically not confirmed, and which I'm not going to take very seriously until and unless they are confirmed. Well, Putin reappeared for this meeting, and today it turns out that he's traveling to the Far East. He's visiting the new Vostochny space station that's being built in Russia's Far East. He's probably going to go to Vladivostok as well, and he's meeting people, and he's back on public view. So I think that these speculations that something has happened to Putin, that his control in Moscow is slipping, all of these sort of things, they always seem to me to be based on minimal information. And I think that we can see that they're essentially groundless. Anyway, there was another very important meeting which has just taken place, and this is a virtual meeting between Joe Biden, President of the United States, and Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. And it seems that this was perhaps the last big attempt by the United States to get India to shift its position on the issue of Ukraine, to come out publicly and condemn Russia and to effect take sides against Russia. And Modi stuck to his guns. He refused to shift despite coming under some pressure from Biden, and apparently he refused to condemn Russia. He said that India does want peace. India does want a peaceful conclusion to this conflict, but he did not condemn Russia. He did not say anything. He did not give any indication that India is prepared to impose sanctions upon Russia. And in fact, all the indications are that India is pressing ahead with its commercial dealings with Russia, just as China is. And there was a report the other day, one which I can't fully confirm, but which I suspect is probably true, that China is now moving purposefully to moving the entire basis of the oil and gas trade with Russia onto RMB, onto Chinese currency. So the diplomatic push against Russia has run, in effect, up against its limits. The United States has been very successful in getting all the European powers on side. It's been fairly successful with Japan, though the Japanese have insisted that they're going to continue with their oil and gas developments with Japan, with the Russians. The South Koreans have also imposed sanctions, though apparently these are less all-embracing even than the Japanese ones, and Singapore has imposed some sanctions too, though these are less impressive than the South Korean ones. So that seems to be the limit. Other countries, most of the countries around the world, are now refusing to join the sanctions bandwagon. The Mexican president, President Obrador, made certain comments which seemed vaguely critical of the Russians, but not to any massive extent. And again, I get the sense that the Western powers have been disappointed by Mexico's response. I suspect that these comments by Obrador reflect the fact that there is a political challenge to him within Mexico. I understand that the expectation is that he will see it off. If he does, I expect him to start hardening his line, which will be to oppose further sanctions pressure on Russia. And I gather that is also, by the way, the general stance across Latin America as well. Meanwhile, the economic situation in Europe continues to be very difficult. Now, yesterday, I received reports that here in London, some petrol stations are starting to run out of petrol, and that there's been problems. Drivers across London are starting to find difficulties getting petrol. I have noticed some other shortages in London shops. Sunflower oil, for example, has become very difficult to find. I'm not going to make any general conclusions about this. Until the pandemic, such shortages were all but unheard of in London, but these at the moment are of a relatively minor level, and it may be that they are an indicator of things to come, or they could be an indicator, or they could be something that perhaps could be resolved relatively quickly over the next few days and weeks. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions. What I will say is that there's been further indications of a power struggle at the top of the government with Boris Johnson and his acolytes, both within the Conservative Party and in the media, now essentially blaming the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who last year seemed to be manoeuvring to launch a bid and a strike against Johnson. That Johnson now that he feels that he's got the wind in his sails with the Ukraine crisis, he seems to be moving fast, both to blame Sunak for the gathering economic problems and also perhaps to engineer his removal, thereby removing from the cabinet the person who up to now has been his most dangerous rival. Well, I say all of this. Frankly, I doubt that most people around the world are interested in British domestic politics and the kind of intrigues that regularly happen within the British Conservative Party. But the fact that we've now had this enormous bout of infighting at the top of the government perhaps is another indicator that the waters for the government in Britain are starting to turn rougher. Anyway, that's me for today. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon. As I said, you can join us on our various other platforms. I mentioned Rumble and Locals at the start of this program. We're also available on many other platforms as well. And of course, we also have our own TV channel. And you can find links to all of these under this video. You can also find links to Patreon and Subscribestar, where you can support us. And you can also, of course, support us by going to our shop. And by the way, you can also support yourself by going to our shop, because we really do have really great things there, not just